Hello guys! In this tutorial we will build a simple responsive login application in React JS using React, MobX, Express and a MySQL database. We're also going to store the session data from the currently logged in user in a production ready session store. So as you can see here, the user can type username and password, click login, a session is started and we're taken to this welcome page. If we refresh the site, we're still logged in, and if I would close the browser and reopen it, the session would still be alive, so we again would be taken to this welcome page. And you can also log out. And yes, to try it out, let's log in with another user. Hit login, and now we're logged in as another user. And then click log out. This application is also responsive, so it works on mobile and tablet and PC. And this tutorial will be divided into two parts. In the first part we will build the front end, and in the second part we will build the back end, which will be an Express JS API. And to follow along this tutorial you need a new version of Node and NPM and access to a MySQL database. And I can recommend that you use WAMP or on Windows or XAMPP on Mac to run a MySQL server on your local client. And if you want to learn more about React or JavaScript programming, I'm going to leave a link to a couple of full courses I recommend in the description. Alright, so let's get started building the front end. Go ahead and open up a command prompt and cd into the folder where you want to install the project. I'm gonna type npx create React app, and let's name this front end. Now, if the npx command is not working for you, it's because you have an old version of npm or node. So make sure you have a new version of both node and npm. Alright, so that's it. It's installed. So let's go ahead and cd into the app. So cd front end. Type npm start. Let's start it up and check that everything works. And it should open now on port 3000. Yes, everything seems to be working. Good. Alright, so the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna install a couple of dependencies that we need. We're gonna need MobX and MobX for React. So go ahead and type npm install MobX and save the library in your package.json file. And there we go. We're also gonna type npm install MobX for React, so MobX React. Let's go ahead and save that library to the package.json file as well. And there we go, it's installed. Now go ahead and open up the project in your preferred text editor, and we're gonna open up package.json. We're gonna add a homepage property here, set it to the root. This lets React know where the actual homepage is served from, and in this case we're gonna serve it from the root folder. All right. So let's go ahead and open up app.js. I'm gonna change the indentation here to 4. I'm also gonna change the syntax to Babel, JavaScript /Babel, and I'm gonna just indent this a bit here. And we can remove everything between the div with the class name of app. We can also remove the uppercase on this because we're going to be using different CSS classes. So name it app instead. We can also go ahead and remove the logo because we won't be using it. We're also going to change this to a class-based component. So class app extends react.component. Right. And since it's a class-based component, we're also gonna need the render method here, like that. So let's type npm start now. Just check that everything's all right. Yep. So there we go. We can leave the server on for now. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna create a MobX store where we will store some data for the currently logged in user. So go to source, hit new folder, and we can name this folder stores. In here is where we will keep all our MobX stores. Go ahead and create a new file. We can save this as user store.js. And we're gonna go ahead and import extend observable from MobX. And then let's go ahead and create the actual user store. Let's just add a comment here. And we're gonna make this a class, name it user store. Define a constructor. And in the constructor, oops, that wasn't meant to happen. In the constructor, we're gonna add an extend observable, which will contain our properties for this store, alright? I'm gonna type this to refer to the class instance we're in. So let's see here, like that. And in here, we're gonna keep some data later. Let's add loading to know if the login form is loading or not. We're also gonna use a boolean here called isLogin to determine whether or not the user is logged in. We're also gonna store the username like a string that is empty from the beginning. All right. We just have to export the store. So export default, new user store. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a new instance of the user store class, which contains the extend observable, which contains the data that we're using with MobX. All right. So that's it for the user store. Let's go ahead and open up app.js and import the user store. Yes, so we have it available. We're not gonna use it quite yet, but we will use it later. Stores/user store. All right, so now we're gonna have to create a couple of components. We're gonna have to create a login form component, an input field, and a submit button. We will create all of the elements you saw when I showed you what we will create as a individual component. All right. So let's go up to source, click new file. We can copy app.js here. And let's save this as login form.js. You can remove the user store and app.css from this component. And let's rename this to login form. And the class name for this can be, let's see, we can use login form like that. So lowercase and then uppercase for form, all right? I'm gonna go ahead and copy this, and we're gonna create a component called input field. And I'm gonna explain in just a second what all of these components will be doing, and you will notice later as well. So let's rename this to input field. We can use class name of input field, lowercase and then uppercase as well. And paste again, and let's create a component called submit button.js. So let's rename this to submit button. And we can do the same for this class name here. So submit button like that. All right. So the login form is gonna contain the actual form for logging in, and the form will consist of 2 input fields and 1 submit button, right? So we can go ahead and close this for now. Close this. And then go ahead and import the login form. From login form, import input field from input field, and import the submit button from submit button. All right, let's just tidy up this a bit here. So like that. So now let's go down here and we're gonna start by actually writing the API calls here that we're gonna need in this component. Now we don't even have an API yet because we're gonna create it in the next tutorial, but we're gonna define the methods and the calls to the API even though it doesn't exist. All right, we're gonna use some error handling as well, so it won't actually bother the application without an API. So let's start by defining the component mount function. We're gonna make this an async method so we can use the await keyword in this. And then we're gonna say try. Let's also define a catch so we can catch an error here. And if we have an error, oh wait, let's do that later. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna define a let variable called res for result. We're gonna say await fetch. We're gonna fetch an API point called isLoggedIn, which we will create in the next tutorial. And we're gonna use a method of post. We're gonna define two headers for this request. The first is accept. And we only want to accept, Jesus. We only want to accept application/JSON. And the content type for this request is also application/JSON, all right? So what this is gonna do is when the app component mounts, when it's finished loading, it's gonna check if the user is logged in or not by checking a session. And we're gonna deal with the result here in the component mount method. So let's create a variable called result. And we're gonna get the result from this res as JSON, all right? And then we can say if result and result.success. Now the reason we're using result.success, you can call this anything, but we're gonna send this back as a property, which is a boolean set to true or false. So go ahead and name it success. So if the user is logged in, will be the case here. We're gonna say user store, so the store we has created stores. And we're gonna say loading is false, because now the user is logged in, so the app won't have to load anymore. The data has been retrieved. And we're also gonna say is logged in equals with true, because that's gonna be true in that case. And we're also gonna set the username to result.username, and we'll pass back this as a property as well from the API. And if things doesn't go as planned and we're not logged in, we're gonna set loading to false. And of course, is logged in has to be reset if it was previously set. So we're gonna set is logged in false. And then if something goes really terribly wrong, we're gonna say user store dot loading equals with false, and user store dot is logged in equals with false. And if you don't know what this is, it's a catch error handling. So if an error is returned from the API, this is gonna be called is everything goes well, and we get the results we want that we are sending back. Some of these one of these statements is gonna be called, all right? Then we're also gonna have to define a logout function. So let's go ahead and copy this. and call this, we can name it do logout, and it's gonna be an async function as well, because we're gonna use the same fetch method here with the wait keyword, and we will define an API endpoint in the next tutorial called logout. It's gonna be post, and we're gonna set the same header, so we can leave that as it is. We're gonna use the result here as well. So if result and result.success, can remove loading because we won't be using that in the logout function. However, we're gonna set is logged in to false. That means the user has logged out. And let's also reset the username in the user store, right? And we can remove this else. And in case of an error here, let's just console.log the error so we can debug it. All right. So now that's it for the API calls in the app.js component. We're gonna go down here to render. We're gonna build some rendering logic here. So we're gonna say if user store dot loading, so if the app is loading, we're gonna return some HTML. Go ahead and copy this, div class name app. We're also gonna add a new div here with the class name of container, and inside the container, let's just say loading, please wait. So the user knows that the application is loading. And if you open up the app now, you can see that it is actually loading, because in the user store we have set loading to true, right? And then let's say else. And by the way, we're gonna add some CSS for this application in just a second. So the first thing that can happen here if it's not loading is that the user can actually be logged in. So let's say if user is logged in, let's go ahead and copy this, return. And we're gonna say welcome, and we're gonna display the user store dot username. We're also gonna display a submit button for logging out, and we'll create this submit button in a little while. Let's define a couple of props for this. So we can use something called text, which we can define in this later, which can be logout. We can set disabled to false. Let's say on click equals with this dot, and then call the function we just defined, which is an API call to the logout endpoint, right? And the reason we're using different components for this is that you can reuse them, all right? So a submit button simply means a button, and you can use it anywhere. And by defining props like this, we can set values dynamically, all right? So we can reuse the same components for multiple purposes. And we will use a callback here for the onClick. So inside the submit button, we'll actually call the prop onClick. So this is the function that determines what will happen on click on the actual button. You will see later. All right, so that's it if we are logged in. And if we're not logged in, this is what will be returned. So class name app, let's copy a container here as well. And let's just say login form. So we're gonna display the login form if we are not logged in. All right. So now we're gonna go ahead and import something called an observer from MobX React, and we will wrap our app component in this observer to make the app listen for changes, to make this component listen for changes in the user store. All right. So if we go ahead and open up the browser now and hit refresh, you can see that you're getting just a couple of milliseconds of loading. Please wait. And then the user store is updated, setting user store.loading to false, since we're getting an error since we haven't created the API endpoint yet, which then renders the login form, right? So that's the first part of building the UI for this login application. In the next part, we will continue building the login form, the input field, and the submit button. Bye bye.